We all know the rules when it comes to flying on an airplane. We've all seen the prohibited items list at check-in, and if you are a frequent flyer, you can probably even recite the safety demonstration yourself. Many of the rules as passengers have been birthed throughout the years because someone somewhere decided to go just a little too far. A reminder of this, a possible case of a careless passenger, came in a terrifying tragedy that claimed the lives of over 100 people on one July day in 1973. The disaster highlighted a massive danger on all commercial planes and paved the way for radical change and legislation in the aviation industry. July 11th, 1973. A Boeing 707 passenger plane was making a routine scheduled flight between Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Paris's Orly airport. The aircraft was operated by the then Brazilian national airline Varig. The transatlantic route connecting South America to Europe is a very popular one. Varig operated this flight with an extension onto London Heathrow, which was to take place after landing in Paris. The Boeing 707 to those in aviation probably needs no introduction, but so we're all on the same page, the 707 was the most successful passenger jet plane of its day. In a new age of jet travel, a number of newer generation planes hit the scene, with the 707 being flown by some of the world's best airlines and best pilots. It is also a plane we've talked about a lot on the channel before for various reasons. This 707, however, was particularly curious. It was a convertible variant of the plane. This aircraft could quickly be configured with either passenger seating or be swapped out for a cargo configuration, making this 707 a very versatile machine. On this occasion, it left Rio in the very early hours of the morning and was flying 134 passengers and crew to France. On this flight, there were a total of 8 pilots. However, there were only 4 in the cockpit at the time the accident began to unfold. 49-year-old Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva was one of the most experienced pilots at Varig. He was a captain with nearly 18,000 hours to his name. He was joined on the flight deck by his first officer, 46-year-old Alvio Basso, flight engineer, 38-year-old Clona Bello, and navigator, 43-year-old Zilmar Gomez. All of them were experienced pilots in their own right. In the cabin were 117 passengers, plus the relief flight crew and flight attendants. There were a total of 134 people on Varig Flight 820 that day. There was even some high-profile passengers on the flight, including Brazilian musician Agostinho dos Santos, a legend in the bossa nova genre. Also on board was President of Brazil's upper house, Valinto Muller, certainly a character with a very interesting history. That day actually happened to be his 73rd birthday. The time was after 1 p.m. The aircraft had been in the air for many hours, and the flight crew began making preparations for landing, having reached the western regions of France. The pilots initiated a descent, guiding their 707 from cruising altitude down to the instructed height of 8,000 feet. The pilots were handed over to Paris-Orly approach, where they then reported in at 1:57. Approach controllers gave Flight 820 a set of instructions for landing onto runway 26 at Orly. Orly Airport has multiple runways. Runway 2608 is found on the south side. Controllers gave the instruction for the Varig plane to fly in from the west, pass over the site, intercepting a radio point positioned at the airport, then fly outbound before turning back in onto the runway. Shortly before and during this correspondence between the flight crew and air traffic controllers, a passenger, we don't know who, got up from their seat and made their way to the aft right lavatory. One can assume they did what anyone would normally do in the toilet. But it is believed that this passenger lit up a cigarette. Once finished, this cigarette was discarded into the lavatory waste bin. I'm going to give you a moment to take a wild guess as to what happened next. It should be noted that we don't know this with 100% certainty. This is just a logical scenario that investigators came up with to explain the origin of the devastating fire that followed, that consumed this aircraft. It's apparently even possible for an electrical fault to have been the origin of the fire, but further details on how this could have interacted with the garbage could not be found. Regardless, the fire started in the waste bin in the right side lavatory at the back of the plane. The waste bin itself was contained inside the unit of the sink. If the careless passenger theory is assumed to be correct, then it is likely that this individual probably did not think much of it in the moment and left the toilet none the wiser to the deadly scenario they had just created. At 1:58, the first sign of real trouble had reared itself on board. As the fire had burst out of the waste bin and smoke bellowed into the cabin, the alarm had sounded to the crew. The pilots radioed out to the ground they were, quote, having a problem with fire on board. Immediately, the approach plans were changed. Instead of passing over the airport as was originally planned, controllers offered a straightened approach onto runway 07, which is on the north side of the airport. The fire on board the aircraft very quickly spiraled out of control. The flight crew had no real means to fight the fire from the cockpit. Though it was contained largely to the rear of the plane, it was the noxious fumes that made the situation desperate. The flight attendants and presumably the off-duty flight crew began pushing passengers to the front of the plane. It is critical to note here that the pilots did not have a single second to waste. They needed to get their plane on the ground as fast as possible. The smoke only had one direction it could go, and it was only a matter of 2 to 3 minutes after the problem was first noticed that smoke entered the cockpit. Though the pilots donned their oxygen masks, the aircraft's instruments and visibility outside of their windshield was becoming difficult to see. On top of that, the flight engineer, following the procedures laid out by Varig, cut some of the electrical systems on the plane, leading to the cockpit instruments becoming unreliable. There wasn't enough time to make it to Orly Airport, even with a straight-in approach. They were still a few miles from the runway. There were 134 people on that plane. Numerous of those sat aft in the cabin, likely succumbed to the noxious smoke and died from the carbon monoxide poisoning before the plane could even land. In an environment enriched with carbon monoxide, death can occur in a matter of a few minutes. Captain De Silva made the decision to make a false landing onto an onion field just ahead of the plane. The landing gear was lowered and the flaps were extended to their maximum setting. Just before touching down on the field, Captain De Silva lifted the nose and banked slightly to the left. In the moment just before the crash landing, the plane skimmed over the tops of small trees. At the touchdown, the landing gear was ripped from the plane, causing the fuselage to collapse onto the ground where it began to skid. The engines were then torn off from the wings. The 707 skidded to a halt in the middle of the field with the fuselage intact. The disaster, though, was certainly not over. In the modern day, there are evacuation procedures for this kind of scenario. Airplane evacuation rehearsals are practiced often by flight attendants and even aircraft manufacturers. The process of emptying a plane of its passengers has been refined so well that even the largest passenger planes can be evacuated in less than 2 minutes. In this case, the passengers who were still alive, all of whom must have been at this point in the front of the plane, were apparently told to remain seated. One passenger, 21-year-old Riccardo Trajano, ignored this instruction. He made his way all the way from the back of the plane and had positioned himself in the forward galley before the plane crashed. And he was the only passenger from the plane to survive. One other passenger did make it out of the plane along with a flight attendant. However, those two sadly fell unconscious and died on the field. Every single of the remaining 115 passengers perished in the fire, which, by the way, as it was sat there burning on the field, began to melt the aircraft's skin, the ceiling caving in as evident in this photograph. The horrors that would later be found by investigators looking inside the fuselage are probably best not thinking about. The flight crew of Flight 820 fared much better. The separation between the cockpit and the cabin allowed for all of the primary pilots to escape via the cockpit. The relief captain, purser, and 2 other flight attendants had also made it to the cockpit and therefore survived. 3 other members of crew, 2 flight attendants, and the relief navigator escaped via the forward doors. In all, totaling 11 survivors. Though there were valiant attempts by firefighters to rescue additional passengers from the burning plane, none more could be saved. This was a horrifying accident. Investigators were clearly divided in opinion as to what actually started the fire, but they had established that it had originated in the waste bin in the aft right lavatory. And though it could not be proven that smoking was the conclusive explanation, it was suspected, and the danger was still there. In-flight smoking was allowed almost unanimously prior to the 1970s. In the late 1960s, the first movements against the practice of smoking on airplanes began to gain momentum. Progress was slow in the early 1970s, as some airlines brought in designated smoking areas of planes. The disaster of Varig Flight 820 in 1973 really served to highlight the danger that had been present from smoking for so long. It was enough for aviation authorities to take note, even if the origin of the fire was officially undetermined. The Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, for example, brought in measures as a result of the investigation into this tragedy to ban smoking in lavatories, confining those who want to smoke to do so in designated areas of the plane. And this was largely how things would stay for many more years. The first airline, by the way, to outright ban smoking on their planes completely was not a major carrier like Lufthansa, KLM, Delta, or American Airlines. It was instead Aurigny of the Channel Islands, all the way back in 1977, certainly ahead of its time. In the United States, it took a long time for progress to be made about in-flight smoking. Tobacco companies weren't all too pleased about this conversation taking place. A lot of the progress that was made was actually done in the interest of work safety, as flight attendants had long rightfully complained about the effects of secondhand smoke in an environment where the air is constantly recycled. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the first larger bans on in-flight smoking would be introduced. Slowly, all over the world, smoking on airplanes was becoming a thing of the past. By the time the year 2000 rolled around, it was banned almost everywhere, and in-flight smoking became associated with that bygone era in aviation. But there were some holdouts. Some airlines did not officially ban smoking. Cubana, the national airline of Cuba, allowed smoking well into the 2000s. China only officially banned it in 2017. Egyptair technically allowed their pilots to smoke in the cockpit until one of their planes crashed, again believed to have been a result of smoking in 2016. Despite nearly everyone agreeing that smoking cigarettes on planes is bad, people reportedly still do it, which is why planes still carry ashtrays in the lavatory, because that minority of people, no matter how few and far between they may be, will still try to get away with it. So it is necessary to give them a receptacle so that disasters like this can never happen again. But there is one more thing I should mention before this video ends, and it's to do with Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva. Captain da Silva is among that very unfortunate group of pilots who survived one plane crash, only to die in another, much like German pilot Elisabeth Frisk, who we've talked about on the channel recently. Captain De Silva returned to flying with Varig despite the accident, and he even continued to captain the 707, becoming one of the most senior pilots at the airline. 5.5 years later, on January 30th, 1979, he was flying another Boeing 707, this time in cargo configuration between Tokyo and Los Angeles. 22 minutes after takeoff, the plane just vanished, never to be heard from again. All 6 people that were on board that plane are presumed dead. No wreckage of the aircraft or any remnants of its cargo were ever found. Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well today. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it to be interesting, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, as there is always a new video every Saturday, even if I am in the middle of moving. I will not make this outro long, so I'll swiftly move into thanking my patrons who, over on Patreon, have been supporting the channel now for nearly 2 years. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Some of these names have been here since the beginning, which is just nuts. A big shout out this week to Ridiculous Username, who pledged last week at the highest tier. A massive thanks to you, I really appreciate it. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 48 hours before it goes out publicly on YouTube. Anyway, that is all from me today. Have a great day, and I will see you next weekend. Goodbye!